Hello and welcome back to General Humanities. We've got quite the project today. Today we're talking about medieval Europe as our sort of complement to the discussion of the Byzantines and the Islamic world in our last big PowerPoint presentation video lecture thingy. But honestly, as much as Emma was a tough one for me to put together because there was so much that I didn't know or so much that I was presenting for the first time, I actually found that this PowerPoint was probably just as hard, if not harder, to put together. Part of that is because I'm brain dead at this point. It's been like a month of me just nonstop teaching classes, putting together these lectures, and trying desperately to stay ahead of the class and get this all done so I can maybe, take a weekend off or something. But part of it too is that for the first time in quite a while, we're coming up against the simultaneous problems of knowing too much about some things and knowing too little about others. I've been studying medieval Europe for quite a while, actually. It's been a sort of pet passion of mine, a sort of pet project of mine. I've been trying to sort of increase the visibility of the medieval world in almost all of my classes, wherever it's appropriate, all the way back to teaching Intro to Philosophy once upon a time and insisting on teaching either Boetius or Thomas Aquinas or, one of the other medieval thinkers that I thought would be relevant to the topic. But I don't think I've ever actually taught medieval history such that I need to fill an hour and a half long lecture in order to talk about it. So it might explain at least a little bit of my bullshittery here at the beginning. But I also felt like I wasn't expressing what I wanted. I'm pulling a lot from my research into Christian history in particular, which is why we're going to be focusing on the papacy so much during this discussion. That and the fact that it is really the sort of central power structure in Europe and probably the best point of view for understanding everything else that's going on around us. But I also just my knowledge of the medieval world is very fragmentary. I love so much of the literature, I love so much of the sort of history, I love so much of the theology, I love so much of the art and the architecture, and yet I don't necessarily have the underlying continuity to tie it all together. And upon tying it all together, found that the story was far too long, far too complicated to incorporate everything that I wanted to include. So this is going to be rough. As much as I actually know what I'm talking about here, more than I have in quite a while, it's going to be difficult to sort of present it all. It doesn't prepackage nicely the way that a lot of our history lectures tend to do. So I want to start where I suspect we already are. I want to talk about how we, in 2025, envision the Middle Ages. Because this is itself sort of complicated and interesting, and honestly, it connects to where I'm at a pretty deep level. I think my first few connections to the medieval world were, on the one hand, some fantasy literature like Alexander Lloyd's the Book of Three and the Black Cauldron, but obviously I grew even deeper when I was watching Lord of the Rings or reading Arthurian literature. But we also, in our culture, as much as we have these romantic, fantastical notions of the Middle Ages, as much as we associate, knights in shining armor with fantasy epics and heroism, and, it's the same stuff as Star Wars, only it's actual swords instead of light swords, and, I suspect that a lot of us have that connection, the romanticization of the Middle Ages. This view of the medieval era as a simpler world where virtue was, in fact, enshrined and protected and valuable, instead of sort of ground underfoot by capitalism or industrialism or any of the other sort of modern ills we have. And there is obviously a lie inherent in that. The medieval world was as complicated, as brutal, as cruel as any of the other ages that we've talked about and any of the ages still to come. And plenty of writers gravitated to that as well, especially in the more modern era. We've got George R. R. Martin sort of talking about the Wars of the Roses and the intrigues and murders and assassinations and sort of making that the center point of his dark fantasy drama. And more recently, we've gotten even deeper into this with stuff like the Northmen or Ridley Scott's The Last Duel, where we emphasize the brutality of the Middle Ages, the cruelty, the sort of, unchecked human vice and anger and wrath. Um, and I want to stress that, these are obviously intended to deconstruct our understanding of the Middle Ages, to sort of like explode and destroy the romanticized notions of heroism and high fantasy, to be more real and more gritty in some respect, to provide us a truer account. Or at least that's the way that it usually is presented. And what I want to stress is both are true and both are lies. Like, there is something truly faithful to the medieval perspective that is reflected in the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, or in the work of someone like T.H. White's The Once and Future King, or even like the romanticized, Camelot of like the musical era and the, like whole Kennedy administration connection there. But obviously, none of these things are strictly true. Knights were often just mercenaries out for their own glory, and chivalry was as ignored as it was practiced, and, the notion of, like, the higher echelons of the papacy and, like, the great leaders of the church were, in fact, corrupt and power-hungry in many cases. Like, this is all true. But it's also not necessarily something missing from these stories. Lord of the Rings is pretty quick to point out that there are a lot of craven or corrupt leaders, that there are a lot of people who are lusting for power in their own right. So the fact that they emphasize the triumph of good, the success of the hero, is truly a little misguided, and, taken in too large doses can be a problem. That's, the issue that these other stories are out to correct. But as much as these present themselves as more real, that, I think, makes them even more insidious in some ways. Because it's true that the Middle Ages were full of, plots and counterplots, villainy and tyranny and monstrous lords and machinations behind the scenes and, brutal, violent people, like, taking advantage of their brutality and, destroying whole livelihoods and villages and towns and even nations in some cases. This is all true. But what I want to stress is that the medievals typically did not romanticize it the way that we do. And I know that that's a complicated conversation in its own right, but when we revel in the violence, when we revel in the brutality or the nihilism, when we revel in villains concocting complicated plots and sort of like either being successful or being upended in them, I suspect that says more about us, more about what we want the Middle Ages to look like. Because the Middle Ages were an age of faith. As we saw with the Islamic world, so with the Christians here, many a Christian in the Middle Ages earnestly believed in their own immortality, in their own salvation, and earnestly worked towards making the world a truly better place, according to biblical principle. They were not just deluded, they were not just fools, and I suspect that on some level, we as a culture, when we watch things like The Northman or Game of Thrones, are at the end of the day congratulating ourselves on being terrible people. That rubs me the wrong way, even more than all of the romanticization and the emphasis on heroism that is, in fact, naive in many of the other fantasy works that we tend to look at. So as we look at the Middle Ages, what I want to stress is that I'm not going to be looking at either. This is reality for these people, the same way that your reality is reality to you. Meaning that it's mundane. Like, to the point that medieval writers and medieval artists frequently would depict, like, high, romanticized battles like the ones fought in the Iliad or the Odyssey as happening in their own backyards, happening to their own castles. They thought this was the way the world had always been, and they couldn't see any reason to believe otherwise. Not because they were all, wildly Eurocentric, though they were, but because they were humble enough to realize that, things had not changed that much, and probably would not change that much, because their lives were relatively stable, they knew relatively little about the rest of the world, and figured, if this is the way God made us, presumably God made the rest of the world the same way throughout all of remembered history. So there was a sense that this was just normal. That when villages burned, or when castles were attacked, or when lords fought one another, either for good reasons or for bad, that it was just the way of things. Yes, there were tragedies, and we will definitely look at them. And there were efforts to romanticize both the tragedies and the conquests of the Middle Ages, for sure. In fact, that's kind of the predominant mode of writing and artistic portrayal throughout the Middle Ages, an effort to sort of disregard the realism, the mundanity, the cruelty and brutality that life often offered to the people of the Middle Ages. They sought something higher, and their art reflects that. Um, but the reality was often just kind of boring, mundane, complicated, but not necessarily like sexy complicated, just the normal boring kind of complicated. So as we talk about this, I want you to discard both of these notions. Get rid of your high fantasy notions of noble knights and, medieval armor and the Knights of the Round Table. We'll get to them in their time. But also, get rid of all of your, medieval fascism imagery and your medieval, like, Vikings beating the crap out of each other brutally imagery, because these are also false. Start from the perspective that you have. Start from this is normal, and you'll get a much better sense of what's going on here. So let's back up in time. Pick up where we left off when the Roman Empire fell and is now split into these two very different perspectives between the Western Europeans on the one hand and the Byzantines on the other. Now, as we've talked about, throughout the 6th century, the Byzantines made a pretty concerted effort to sort of like retake much of Italy, much of the old Roman Empire, and were largely successful. But almost immediately after that, with the Islamic conquest, things returned to, a new status, or things were brought to a new status quo. The Byzantines could not maintain hold for long. So in the 6th century and in the 5th century, the dominant thing going on in Europe, like broader than just what's going on with the Roman Empire, either the western or the eastern parts, is there's a lot of peoples on the move. Like in the 5th century in particular, here's Rome, but this is like right before or during Rome's fall. You can see all of this motion. The map is emphasizing all of these people getting displaced, finding new homes, passing through Europe as they're getting displaced. The best theory we have at this point is that this is because of the Huns. Like, they were probably around located around Mongolia or somewhere around there. Again, my knowledge isn't 100% here. This definitely isn't my specialty, and the record keeping at this point in history is abysmal. But it sounds like the Huns were moving through Asia to the west, and basically any time that they bumped into another people, these people effectively became refugees. Like, they were kicked around, they started moving west in order to seek something better for themselves, a better land, better lifestyle, and in the process they kept bumping into all of the other peoples that were already there. So at least part of the problems that Rome was having in the 5th century was because all of these people were bumping into each other. They saw Rome as, a jewel to be conquered and possessed. They were hoping for a better life in some respect, and consequently everyone is shifting, and will continue to shift for like 200 years. Now, the Huns themselves actually made it to the doorstep of Rome, as the story goes, and apparently, like, they were getting ready to take over the whole, like, Roman Ravenna, area, and were actually told off. Like, the story goes that Pope Leo, who was, in charge of the Roman Church at the time, he actually like had a sit-down conversation with Attila the Hun, and we have no idea what was said or what exactly happened, but apparently after this sit-down conversation, Attila the Hun was like, okay, I'm not going to take over Rome, and he turned around and left. Which is itself just shocking. Like, Attila the Hun was unstoppable throughout all of Asia and Eastern Europe. The fact that he just okay, I'm done, and just went home is just remarkable, and probably the closest thing to a miracle that we have yet encountered in Christian history that is truly documented by otherwise indifferent, reliable sources. Probably not the last we'll run into during this discussion, though. But I should stress that the Huns are shifting around all of the nations that were in Europe at the time. Um, but I want to stress, like, I'm not going to get too deep into the individual characters of these groups. Like, we could probably have an entire class talking about the Burgundians or the Anglo-Saxons or the Franks or any of the Gothic tribes or, the Normans or a whole bunch of the different peoples. But again, that's not my specialty, and that will just serve to further complicate this already complicated business. So instead, I just want to emphasize the world is changing for 300 years here, between like 400 AD and 700 AD. Nations are shifting around, they're fighting each other, they're getting in each other's way. The Roman Empire isn't there to sort of slow or stem the tide, so there is just this constant, ongoing shifting and relocating. And this is at least part of the reason why we call this period in European history the Dark Ages. Latin is still being spoken, but it is being changed depending on where you are. The language is sort of dividing up into the constituent Romance languages that we'll be hearing down the road: French and Spanish and Italian and Romanian, and it has its influence on German and Germanic languages like English as well. But in the meantime, like, all of these people are shifting around, trying to find stability in a world that is generally getting pretty unstable. Not everyone is affected here. It seems like there's a lot of stability if you're already living here and you're just, like, swapping out new masters from time to time, though, in many cases these people are getting displaced because they're following their sort of national identity rather than, staying at home with their land. But in any case, what develops is a sort of early feudalism, which, you hear a lot about feudalism as this whole, government structure, and we'll get to that in its own time. But here I want to stress that feudalism, for our purposes, is basically just gang wars. It's local lords getting hired thugs to be able to duke it out with other local lords, effectively fighting over the European equivalent of street corners at this point. It's low-level, uncomplicated, disorganized warfare, effectively. And what changes this, what sort of organizes these different units of people are the popes. In Rome, now that the Gothic tribes, you have a couple of Gothic leaders who claim to take over the throne, who claim to be emperor at various times. Again, this is what causes Boetius to leave in the 5th, 6th century. But the power vacuum that these people leave behind, like the instability that sort of results from all of these people changing hands and all of these power structures changing hands. And remember, again, the Byzantines take over Rome for a decent part of the 6th century and then end up leaving it behind, again, leaving another power vacuum. The papacy sort of rises to fill this position because virtually, I won't say everyone, because this is definitely more complicated than that, but many of the most powerful nations in Europe have already been Christianized for one reason or another. In many cases, they're not, Orthodox Christian, by which I mean they don't follow the Nicene Creed. Many were actually converted by Arius back when that was a thing. Arius was the heretic that the Nicene Creed was designed to conflict. But additionally, Christian missionaries have been busy, have been converting a lot of peoples. Not everyone has been converted. The Anglo-Saxons, in particular, are particularly resistant to conversion at this moment in history. But give it a few hundred years, they will capitulate as well. What it means is that while most of Europe is Christian, the Pope, i.e. the guy in Rome who claims to be leader of all the Christians, is the most powerful person in Europe. And the papacy will continue to be that for literally hundreds of years in this case. So that's why I want to follow the Pope more often than not. As far as, continuity, stability throughout the European world in the Middle Ages, the Pope is very much the guy to watch. And the whole of the Middle Ages, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, is kind of the story of the papacy's rise and fall. Now, I should mention especially that, it's not a stability in the sense that it is like a monarchy passing from hand to hand without trouble. If you look at the long list of the popes as it appears in, the St. Peter's Basilica, you'll notice it changes hands a lot. In the 7th century, in the 9th century, in the 10th century, it is a very unstable position. Popes are literally poisoning one another for the jobs. They're appointing their kids for the jobs because there are no restrictions on the popes either having sex or having families at this point in history. Like, it is very Game of Thrones in the competition to figure out who is going to be the pope. So again, don't want to downplay that here. But if we're going to talk about the papacy and we're going to talk about the power structures in the, Christian Catholic world, we should also sort of mention the monks here too. Like, we talked about them briefly when we were talking about the Orthodox Church, and I emphasized that they sort of operated as a counterbalance to the imperial element in Byzantium, and especially since, like, the patriarchs were chosen by the emperor, having a sort of, like, independent arm of the church separate from both the patriarchy and also the empire was important to the independence of Christianity at this point. The same is true here in Western Europe. But if anything, the monks are more powerful because, A, there isn't an emperor to sort of, like, insist on a secular power structure outside of the papacy, but also because the monks in the Western Roman Empire, or the monks in, like, the Western European world, tend to be more entrenched and more organized. Again, Saint Benedict is the guy to look at here. He is very much a 6th century saint who writes this monastic rule that ends up being sort of the foundation for basically all of the monks. And especially when Charlemagne takes over, like, he insists everyone's got to adopt the rule of Benedict. And most of the monks do so without any complaints. Again, it's meant to be pretty benevolent as these things go. But the rule insists that monks have to obey their abbot, that they have to sort of separate themselves from the rest of the world, definitely not seeking any, like, worldly power or anything. And in most cases, these monks will also dedicate themselves to studying, understanding, and, importantly, copying the Bible. Which means that these monasteries become basically early bookmaking factories. As we, saw in the Khan Academy videos, bookmaking was an elaborate, time-consuming, complicated process here in the Middle Ages. And consequently, like, the whole business of making a book was painfully expensive and painfully slow. But importantly, you'll also notice it was also very careful. Texts like the Codex Amiatinus, like that, for the earliest full Latin Bible, the earliest full copy of the Vulgate that we have, is a work of art in its own right. Like, the words are carefully printed on the page. The texts are often carefully illuminated with these beautiful pictures. The binding is, like, tough and sturdy, such that you can have a text that survives, like, 1,300 years the way that Amiatinus has. It's a remarkable work that they produce at the end of the day, even if it does take a whole lot of effort and a whole lot of money to do that. But that means that the monasteries become rich and powerful in their own right. As they did in the Byzantine world, these places become fortresses. They are subject to attacks pretty frequently, especially here in the Dark Ages and among the Viking raids in the 8th and 9th centuries, especially when, like, the Carolingian Empire no longer protects them. But nonetheless, it doesn't change the fact that the monks are a power to be reckoned with. And much of the great writing from this era, much of the great literature and art from this era comes from the hands of the monks. So we will be bumping into them often, and their disagreements with the Pope are going to be a pretty constant, like, background noise for our discussion of the Middle Ages, as we'll see. Now, the other thing to understand here, though, is that as much as the monks are doing their level best to preserve scholarship, study, literature, the great Greek philosophers, like, all the things that the classical world had to offer before Rome fell, they are not wholly successful. After Rome falls, the understanding of the Greek language and literature kind of dissipates a bit. And we are left with the Latin world, like all of the Latin writers, like St. Augustine or Boetius, the Latin language, the Latin Vulgate. These are the things that are preserved in the Dark Ages and throughout the medieval world, while the Greeks, like in the original, are lost. Any Greek translations that we have, like the Timaeus that Boetius gave us, or the fragments of Aristotle that have survived, those are written in Latin, and therefore that's the only way we understand them. But some of the core texts that were really important to the ancient world, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, are in fact straight up lost throughout this period. And won't be recovered until they're recovered from the Islamic world, because they've held on to those texts and preserved them shockingly well. Because remember, the Islamic world is having a golden age while this is going on, lest we forget. Now, the person who sort of organizes the attempt to like collect and preserve these works is our guy Charlemagne. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was the leader of like a one of the kingdoms under the papal sort of watch. His father had been very successful in combat and had taken over much of France. Charlemagne was poised to do the same, but in 800 AD on the dot, like on Christmas Day of 800, because symbolism is important, the Pope announces that Charlemagne is now the official Holy Roman Emperor. And this is not meant to be subtle. Like, the church is effectively resurrecting the Roman Empire according to its papal authority here on Earth. And this is a flex in some ways. Like, on the one hand, yes, they need someone to organize all of these petty kings and lords who are constantly fighting with each other and, like, get them all into line. But on the other hand, it is very much a recognition of the power that Charlemagne already wields. He is a threat to the church in some respect, and bringing him into line, creating an institution that makes him an ally instead of an enemy, seems like a really good move at this point. Though obviously there's a lot of complications to be had here. Now, as it happens, Charlemagne seems like a real upstanding guy, historically speaking. Under Charlemagne, yes, he does manage to conquer and consolidate much of the Western European world. Basically, all of what we see as France today, virtually all of what we see as Germany, as well as the Italian papal states that are sort of like willing to sort of like recognize themselves under his secular authority, at least for the time being, so long as he recognizes that the papal authority is ultimately superior. And this Carolingian Empire, like this, as much as it is absolutely tiny compared to so many of the other empires we've talked about in this class, is going to be super influential. Not the least of which is because, again, it happens in Western Europe and everything is Eurocentric. Again, we're sort of like capitulating to Eurocentrism in this discussion because the European Middle Ages are what we're talking about. We already had our opportunity to talk about like the rest of the world, and I'm hoping that I did it justice. I definitely don't want to like emphasize this to the detriment of the other. But I also, when you talk about Western culture, these are the guys who win the day eventually as far as history is concerned. Like, they're the ones that take over the world. They're the ones that build all of the great empires of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Thus, we consider it a priority to talk about them, for better or for worse. And I want to stress that the unification of France and Germany in particular, like, the lines on which this nation is erected will be a matter of, like, contest and frustration and war for literally centuries, if not millennia to come. Like, it's no error that France and Germany have somehow been at each other's throats from about this moment in, like, the 840s or 50s all the way to the 1910s, 20s, and beyond. This is how, like, historical divisions and cultural problems get made, folks. But I also want to stress that as much as, like, Charles the Great was a conqueror and a unifier and a political figure, he was also very keenly interested in preserving and continuing scholarship. He hired dozens of scholars from around the medieval world, especially from England, where scholarship was alive and well, especially in the monasteries. Again, long story, we'll touch on it a little bit in a moment, but, give it some time. But he wanted to make more and more schools, more and more monasteries, where texts could be, like, preserved and duplicated. He wanted to emphasize, the pattern of learning and keep this stuff going, because as far as we can tell, he noticed that it was now or never. Like, whatever we lose now is lost forever. Whatever we gain now, whatever we preserve now, will be preserved forever. And he was dead right. Like, As the video emphasized, like 90% of the most ancient copies of like Latin works that we have are Carolingian copies. Like we have very few texts that go all the way back to the Roman Empire that do in fact date back to like the 4th or 5th centuries CE, with the possible exception of Bibles. Instead, like if you do in fact want to read something like Plutarch or something like Virgil, probably the oldest extant source that we have comes from a text made by someone during this Carolingian Renaissance. A text dating back to this 9th century era. And notice that Charlemagne is a practical guy, and he is very much simplifying the efforts of scholars and monks to copy books at this point with his Carolingian minuscule. Like, I realize that fonts are probably the most boring thing I've ever talked about in this course, and I accept that willingly, even as I encourage you to study fonts because they're fascinating. But I want to stress that, like, old school pre-Carolingian fonts were a messy business. Like, there was no standardized form of or writing language on the page at this point. At least in part because this is the first time that like the actual business of making books has become as standardized as it has. Like, yes, books were a major part of the Roman world, but they were not necessarily intended to last. Not the way that they are here. The Romans didn't think that there was any chance that the empire was going to fall. Remember the Aeneid and its guarantee of no more war ever, thanks, Emperor Augustus. Obviously, that didn't pan out. So now, here in the Middle Ages, with the world being as dangerous and unpredictable as it is, a concerted effort has to be made in order to preserve these works in forms that could endure the vicissitudes of history. So we start writing more simply. The Carolingian minuscule is designed to be legible, it is designed to be easy and simple, and it is designed to be turned out quickly. Now, on one hand, I should stress, this represents a decrease in quality. Like, the beauty of the old manuscripts and the sort of, like, inconsistency had its admirers, has its admirers today. But in order to make this more readable, more legible, easier to work with, we had to standardize it. And this is, in many ways, the first standardized font in the history of bookmaking. Like, just wait until we get to the later Gothic fonts and, we actually get, like, the printing press, at which point fonts really are a thing instead of just, like, a practice that, various people all agree to undertake. But yeah, like, we are talking about the first ever standardized alphabet, like, standardized presentation of the alphabet in a very real sense. Now, I should also emphasize that at the same time, like, during the Carolingian Empire, we see the first sort of, like, global architectural style emerge since the Roman Empire and the Byzantine world. Carolingian architecture is rudimentary in many ways. You'll notice that these are very simple structures. Like this here, I believe that this is meant as a scriptorium or like another monastic device that sort of got converted to a cathedral when the rest of the village was destroyed, as happens. But you'll notice that, again, simple edifices, like we have a cross-shaped structure here. Like we're looking at the back end of the building. We're going to do this pretty consistently in the picture of architecture as I present it, because oftentimes, like, the more ornate sides of the building tend to not necessarily be the facade. Again, it's messy, it's complicated, we'll talk about it more, but notice that it is simple stonework. It is simple stonework. There's not like these elaborate domes or anything. We do build for height in some places, but only in certain parts of the building because, the architectural like support isn't necessarily as sophisticated. We have these narrow windows, ideal for defense purposes, as not necessarily for giving light. And again, we don't have the architectural support systems in order to, allow or encourage elaborate windows which can't bear weight. Like, this is sort of the default architectural style that we'll see during Charlemagne's rule. It is going to be the default for many years to come until like architects start to get more creative in the later Middle Ages. Now, the trouble with Charlemagne's empire is that we do not have a primogeniture system here at this point. At least not in Charlemagne's family, at least not in this part of the world. And consequently, when not Charlemagne himself, but when Charlemagne's son, like he has only one son, his one son inherits the entire empire basically altogether. But when he dies, he has 3 sons, and he has to fairly divide up the empire between all 3 of them. Which leads to the horrible Treaty of Verdun. Obviously, you've got what looks like France over here and a lot of what looks like Germany over here, but whatever this nonsense is just garbage. Like, this is an indefensible, horrible, like, structured country that is almost certainly going to fall immediately, and it does, in fact, fall immediately. Like, it is taken over very quickly. But again, you'll notice this is the exact same stuff that people are going to be fighting over, the exact same area of land that will be fought over and contested for centuries to come. Remember that. But what I want to emphasize for our purposes is that this does in fact kick off the first nations as we understand it, the first sort of like political entities, sort of separate from the church, separate from this Carolingian empire. Like, no, France and Germany do not emerge in whole cloth out of this. We do still have the basic feudalist structure going on here. And I want to stress that, like, these regional kings are not terribly powerful, are not terribly organized, and rarely do have control over their entire holdings in some respect. Though we do start seeing a king of England, a king of France, the Holy Roman Emperor who is supposedly in charge of all of Germany and all of Italy, possibly being contested or debated with, you know, like France or England or any of these nations at this point. And the basic feudal structure, again, it is rough, it is not consistent, different places practice it differently, but it is functional and it is practical, and this is why it tends to be the dominant mode of, you know, government here in the Middle Ages. You've got your king, he rules a whole empire, a whole territory, a whole lot of land. But the only way that he keeps it under control is he gets his lords, his vassals, to sort of carve up the land themselves and take over smaller territories within that land. And that these lords themselves will carve it up into even smaller sections, and in some cases give those lands to knights, the vassals to the lords, or, you know, control it for themselves or give them to high-ranking individuals, while the knights are out defending the land, you know, equipping themselves, making sure that they can stand up for the lord when the time comes. So the knights protect the lands of the lords. These are the armies you raise when, in fact, the lands are threatened. You usually have a contingent of knights, heavily armored, with horses, like, ready to stand for the lord and, you know, basically serving as a super soldier of some kind. And then you have your sort of peasant army, like, conscripted when necessary in order to just put warm bodies on a field, although, you know, they're usually coming with rudimentary tools and weapons and can't actually, you know, fight as nearly as effectively as these trained soldiers and leaders that you've got in the knights. In the meantime, though, the peasants are doing all of the actual work here. They're farming the land, and therefore all of their goods, all of the food that they make will gradually move up all the way to the king. They're going to pay taxes, pay rent. All of that money is going to go back up to the king. And in response, the king is going to protect them so the peasants can, in addition to farming the land and paying their taxes, they will have, you know, a place to stay. They will have food to eat. It is supposed to be a mutually beneficial system. Everyone works here. Nobody is just a hanger-on. Nobody is useless. This is the theory underlying feudalism. And like I said, at the end of the day, this is just medieval gang warfare. It is, at the end of the day, just a very basic political structure that works under the circumstances, that works on a fairly small scale and that allows both a lot of autonomy for individual rulers, lords, and knights, while also giving them just enough top-down, authority and organization that when a bigger threat arises, when another king raises their army, they have someone to respond and to organize their efforts in order to fight back. Now, we've talked about France, we've talked about Germany, we've talked about feudalism. Let's talk about the actual nobles here, how we get these kings and lords. And I gotta stress, this is nonsense. Like, everybody knows it's nonsense. Faking a noble line is actually a pretty proud tradition in the medieval world. And as much as we do have these elaborate family trees that are set up from time to time, many of them have in fact been doctored or forged. Many of them are written after the fact, and again, the record keeping, especially prior to the Carolingian era, is so weak that there's very little evidence that any of these kings, lords, or otherwise really do have some sort of noble lineage, especially when many of these family trees apparently draw their noble lineage all the way back to either Roman emperors, or in some cases, like, they even go so far as to say that they come from, like, Trojan stock. Like, remember the Aeneid and how, like, supposedly Aeneas is, like, the progenitor of Rome, and Aeneas is the last survivor of Troy, so therefore Rome is, like, the last scion of Troy. Like, we get that here. The British claim that Brutus, who apparently sailed with Aeneas, is the guy who founded Britain. And Francus of France apparently founded France. Both of whom, again, sailed with Aeneas, and this is how they sort of justify their claims, even though there are literally no copies of the Iliad or Odyssey left. The Aeneid is in fact there, and everybody reads it, because remember, it's written in Latin, and therefore we still have Latin at this point in time, but there's no justification for any of this. And consequently, as much as there isn't very much social mobility here in the Middle Ages, like, lords stay lords, peasants stay peasants, there is a shocking amount of social mobility surely by, like, manipulating records and manipulating record keeping. If you've got a talented forger, or basically just anyone who can write, they can absolutely bullshit your way to making a peasant into a knight, or a knight into a lord, by, discovering this long-lost lineage, this long-lost heritage, and no one's going to ask too many questions, especially if it's politically expedient. There are plenty of accounts of relatively successful peasants who become pretty wealthy in their own right, and the lord effectively just smudges the fine print in order to make them, like, a lord by proxy. It does happen. So as much as the Middle Ages do have this sort of strict feudalist system, don't get bogged down in it. It is not necessarily as strict as it looks. The rules are very flexible here, and that seems to be a feature, not a bug, of the feudalist medieval world. Being able to respond to new needs, new circumstances, is the whole reason why feudalism manages to stick around for the better part of 1,000 years and change. Now, here we have what Europe looks like around 1000 AD, around 1000 CE. Again, in the wake of the Carolingian Empire sort of falling apart and being divided up as badly as it was, chaos very much ensues. France remains relatively stable throughout all this, which is important to remember because France is going to be the first of the nations that kind of come out of this whole giant stew of lords and, petty fiefdoms and disagreements across these peoples. The Holy Roman Emperor, by contrast, yes, he is a fixture of the Germanic and Northern Italian world, but he will also only sort of be the head of a very loose confederation of lords that really do not identify with one another at all. France unifies relatively quickly in the medieval world. Even here in 1000, you've got, the earliest rumblings of France being consistently ruled by the same family for a long time. In Germany, that's just not the case. You've got your Holy Roman Emperor, but that is it. Bohemia, Saxony, Bavaria, these all very much identify with themselves and their own kinds of people far more than they identify with the Holy Roman Emperor or see themselves as Germans in some respect. And that will persist well into the modern era. The Holy Roman Empire is going to be an anachronism by the 17th century, but it will still be there. But at this point, you might very well ask, okay, so what about England? Like, what's the deal? Why do we keep talking about France and Germany? Like, there isn't England a huge deal in the Middle Ages? Yes, absolutely. But England is very much untouched by the Carolingian processes, at least until the 11th century when the Norman conquest happens and, like, the whole thing starts to get standardized and Frankified. It's a whole thing. The truth is, I don't know that much about British history, which I emphasize because as soon as you start looking at the medieval world, you're going to get inundated in British history. Because we're doing this in English, and therefore the sort of primary focus in British schools is, shocker, British history. So as far as I know, like, if you were speaking French and talking about the Middle Ages, you would get a giant pile of French history in the same way. If you were speaking German, you'd get a whole bunch more about the Holy Roman Empire and the various divisions that it's sort of controlling. So again, on the one hand, I do want to stress, yeah, England's a huge deal right now, but I also want to put it in context. I don't want to get bogged down in British history. I don't want to, prioritize the British just because I happen to be speaking their language right now. What I want to stress is that the British were, in fact, a center of especially medieval education and learning. Being separated from France, Germany, and all of the fights going on the continent actually means that it was a pretty great place for monasteries and scholarship to thrive. Ironically, a lot of this actually comes from Ireland, which for some reason isn't even on this map. Like, it's noticeably absent. Like, I can't even right now. But the Irish had a much stronger connection to the church in the 5th and 6th centuries, and consequently they Christianized much of Scotland, i.e. northern England, way before they managed to make it into, like, what we usually call England or Britain today, like southern England. And consequently there were a whole bunch of monasteries, a whole bunch of educational centers, a whole bunch of, like, Christian churches in the north of England well before there were in the south, and in Ireland even before that. In fact, it's the Irish church that pioneers the sacrament of confession. Like, apparently confession wasn't a thing in the Catholic Church until, like, the Irish started practicing it, possibly due to, earlier Druidic or pagan rituals. And then, as we'll see, by the 12th century, it's adopted everywhere. Like, it's this whole thing. Irish Christianity is a huge deal. I have no idea what happened to the Irish, but, like, yes, they were kind of the center of education and learning for, like, a good 150 years there before they fell off the face of the earth. I don't even know what to tell you, because the Brits are going to absolutely screw the Irish for hundreds of years once they get their shit together. But also, I should stress, like, Northumbria in particular, like, it's noticed on this map, that's because there's a major monastery, a major scriptorium at Northumbria that is apparently the place where Codex Amiatinus actually was first produced. Like, they were a huge deal in, like, the 7th and 8th centuries, even before Charlemagne. Like, they were this massive center of learning. They had clear connections to the papacy and Rome. And yet, somehow this gets lost in the whole discussion. Like, somehow this isn't as big a deal as, you might think. But also, Britain is being sort of, like, Christianized from both sides. You've got the Irish coming at it from the north, but you've also got this guy, St. Augustine of Canterbury, who comes at it from the south. Like, he is the first official Catholic missionary sent from Rome to England. He's the guy who founds the cathedral, or, like, the church in Canterbury, and by becoming the Archbishop in Canterbury, means that he is effectively the leader of the Catholic faith in England, and will remain so, like, to this day. Like, the Anglican Church is this whole thing. Like, we don't even need to get into it, but the cathedral in Canterbury remains this very important religious center, and especially for Catholicism in England, again, to this day. But I've also got to stress, like, England hasn't settled necessarily at this point. Like, it is probably right about this time that the Anglo-Saxons, like, sweep in and start to take over much of England. So by the time that the Normans get there in the 11th century, like, it is predominantly Anglo-Saxon, which is why I include this chunk of Beowulf here. Again, one of the great works of early British literature. Like, this is probably the great masterpiece of Anglo-Saxon literature, just because it is the one that gets, actually written down in Anglo-Saxon, in Old English. in most cases, the tradition says that it's by Christian missionaries who are trying to simultaneously like preserve their culture and also convert them at the same time. It's a whole thing. Again, I don't want to get too deep into it. I just want you to know England is a major deal here. It is going to be very influential. We're going to touch on it often, but it has a very different sort of history and background than much of the rest of the European world because of its distance, because of its disconnection. So, yes, the Pope is still extremely influential here, again, operating from the Archbishop in Canterbury. But it is just one part of this story and not even the one I necessarily want to focus on, again, despite speaking the British language. So what I do want to keep focusing on, though, is the papacy. Again, this is the major power structure in Europe. It's now divided a bit now that it's struggling with the Holy Roman Emperor, but if anything, that's the story I want to tell. The trick is, here in the 11th century, the papacy is changing. After the 10th century and all of the chaos in the wake of the Carolingian Empire, the monks are gradually insisting on more and more authority over the papal organization and the papal clergy. And increasingly, the monks are getting mad about this practice called simony, which is where, lords under the Holy Roman Empire, secular lords or kings, are appointing bishops or clerical figures, which means that a lot of them are basically just suck-ups to all of these secular lords, which the monks find absolutely offensive, because, again, the church is supposed to be the, residence of God's authority on earth, and therefore the church should be autonomous, should, if anything, have power over the secular lords. So they're getting more and more ticked about this. But they're also getting ticked at the way that the actual power structures within the church are working. The monks have been celibate since St. Benedict. That's a priority of Benedict's rule. The monks are not allowed to have sex. They're not allowed to have kids. Their family ties are not allowed to, or immediately cast off when they enter the monastery. All of this helps to keep the monks focused on God, religion, and the work that is in front of them. And they're frequently encouraging the church to do the same. You guys need to be celibate. You can't have popes giving birth to kids and then making them popes. That is clearly not what, any of this is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about your intelligence. It's supposed to be about your devotion. It's supposed to be about your fitness from the eyes of God. So in the 11th century, we see them making some major changes. The Second Lateran Council in particular in the 11th century changes the way that popes are selected. Up until this point, popes get to choose their successors, but after the Second Lateran Council, again, largely thanks to the efforts of the monks sort of attempting to reform the papacy, now the cardinals and the bishops, all of the leaders of the church, they are all going to get together, they're going to have a big meeting, and they're going to elect the pope from now on. And shocker, literally one of the next popes that they're going to elect is this Pope Gregory VII, who was, in fact, one of these reforming monks back in, the 1060s, and now he becomes effectively the Pope in 1073. And he immediately convenes a synod, and he's like, all right, guys, we're going to do celibacy from now on. All the priests have to be celibate. No more sex, no more families. You are going to devote yourselves 100% to God. And for that matter, he's going to kick out all the simoniacs. Any sacrament, i.e., any of the rituals performed that guarantee your salvation, if it is done by a simoniac, someone who is, paid or accepted payment for the position or was basically appointed by a secular ruler, no longer counts, which is a huge catastrophe. As far as these secular powers are concerned. If the sacrament doesn't count, the people get mad because they aren't going to heaven anymore. It's a pretty good reason to get mad as these things go. So the people will almost always rise up against the leader, and the leader will have to accommodate these changes. Meaning, accept whoever the church puts in their place. It's a pretty powerful, ballsy move on the part of Gregory, but it is an attempt to make the church more in line with its principles. Again, like I said, there are a lot of domineering power structures here in the Middle Ages, but occasionally you run into people who are in fact trying to make the world better. And I suspect that Pope Gregory is in fact one of those people. The trick is that during this process we get a lot of noise from the papacy as well. As the papacy is striving with the secular power structures, as they're sort of trying to reassert their control over the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the things that the papacy does in order to make sure that their control is uncontested is they start throwing crusades. The Crusades are largely mustered by the Pope. They are encouraged on the grounds that like anyone who joins up with the Crusade will get immediate like transportation to heaven. Like they don't have to worry about any past sins or anything. And seeing as like Catholic priests and the Pope had specifically commanded, all of you knights out there, no more fighting with each other, no more fighting with your lords. Like the code of chivalry can only be used against non-Christians, leaves you with a whole bunch of knights with nothing to do. Like anyone who is in fact, trying to follow the code of chivalry rather than, being some hedge knight who is just like out for mercenary purposes. Suddenly they're highly trained, very expensive warriors who are just sitting around with their thumb up their butt. And finally, the Pope is like, okay, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to assert my power, and I'm going to get all these knights out of the way. And bonus, I'm also going to help the people of the Byzantine Empire now that they're freaking out about these Turkish invasions and attacks. We're going to send all of these lazy knights off to the Holy Land, and we're going to go conquer Jerusalem. Now, again, this is a power move. Like, as much as the Crusades are often framed as this romantic quest to regain the Holy Land from the Muslims, I gotta stress, they don't show nearly the level of organization necessary to make that true, and they definitely don't actually, have the sort of backing to suggest that this is really the case. This is not an organized endeavor, at least not until the Third Crusade. The First Crusade is just a giant mess. It is one part pilgrimage, it is one part military operation, it is one part power grab by people who you probably wouldn't trust to look after your kids. Like, these are all of the mercenaries, all the sketchballs who come out of the work and they're like, oh, you're going to let me get into heaven, eh? Well, good thing I committed all those murders then, because now it won't count towards anything. And they all just march off to the Holy Land, sacking and pillaging along the way, by the way. Like, especially the Jewish communities that they run into. Like, since there are forbidden rules against fighting against Christians, as they suddenly start running out of food or money, they very much start destroying Jewish communities throughout Europe on the way. Hooray, anti-Semitism being alive and well during the Crusades. But they do get to Constantinople, and they do manage to take over a decent bit of the Holy Land. They are basically butt-kicked by the Muslims. You'll remember that this is the same period when the Fatimid dynasty is sort of rising up, and there's a lot of contention between the Fatimids and the Abbasids, who are under the Buyids at this moment. Like, it's a whole giant mess in the Muslim world. They're a little disorganized. They're not necessarily ready to, mount a strong defense here. But they do manage to basically beat the Crusaders into submission. The trouble is, the Crusaders apparently, find the Spear of Longinus. Like, they're just digging in some cemetery or something, while it's cooling their heels, worried that they're not going to get to be successful. And they find this relic, supposedly, and this apparently galvanizes them, and they do, in fact, take over Jerusalem and sack and loot the place, because, again, Crusaders, they're not the greatest guys in the world. So the First Crusade is, in fact, successful. They do, in fact, take over the Holy Land. They do, in fact, take over Jerusalem. They install little Crusader states all throughout Israel and Palestine and Lebanon. And this will be a bit of a thorn in the side for the Muslims, who aren't necessarily organized enough to, take care of this problem. But they will be by the Third Crusade. At the same time, though, throughout the 8th century, 9th century, and beyond, there are also efforts to sort of take back Spain. You'll remember that the Umayyads originally took over Spain, way back in the 6th and 7th centuries. When the Umayyads were expanding their territory, they expanded all the way into Spain and then got kind of beaten in France and just decided, okay, that'll do. But over the next few hundred years, the Christians are going to try to keep fighting back. By the Carolingian Empire, there's a decent Christian contingent in northern Spain, but in the 11th century, they really make some efforts to push further in, and they take over much of Castile here. And by the 12th century, they've basically gone all the way into Toledo. They've gone into much of middle Spain, and by the 13th century, they've conquered basically all of Spain again. We're down to just a little bit of Muslim presence, or Moorish presence, as the Spanish call it, at the very southern tip of the country. Now, importantly, the Spanish Moors, the Spanish Umayyad Arab or Umayyad Islamic leaders, do in fact have a pretty thriving trade network, as much as they are at war with the Christians a lot of the time. And consequently, like, there is in fact a lot of traffic between the Islamic world of Spain and the Crusader, medieval Carolingian or post-Carolingian world of the Catholic Western Europe. But I should stress that when in fact the Crusaders take over Toledo here in the 11th century, they find an absolute treasure trove of old texts, like Greek philosophy translated into Arabic by Arabic scholars and Islamic scholars, along with all of the philosophers that you would expect to go along with that. Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, many of the great philosophers who had been writing at this point, like the leader in Toledo, the leader of Umayyad Spain, who was sort of based there, very much had a soft spot for education and philosophy. And consequently, when the Crusaders took over Toledo, these texts started to get circulated. And gradually the monasteries get a hold of these texts and start translating them into Latin, and increasingly this will be the foundation for the later Middle Ages understanding of Plato, Aristotle, and the great Greek scholars of yesteryear. More on that later. For now, we gotta keep talking about the Crusades to the Holy Land. Like, after the First Crusade concludes, there's a period of some, quiet, just because the papacy is actually having a bit more trouble at the moment. But in the 1140s, the Muslims start pushing back against some of the Crusader states, manage to conquer some of them, and so once again, the Patriarch in Constantinople calls up the, Pope in Rome and says, hey, can you give us some help? And the Second Crusade is raised to do that. But it doesn't really go anywhere, and it's super boring, so don't worry about it. The Third Crusade, on the other hand, is a much bigger deal. The Third Crusade happens after Saladin, the great, like, Islamic general and statesman who sort of, like, single-handedly founds the Ayyubid Caliphate in, the Holy Land area, like in Egypt, sort of carves it out of the Fatimid dynasty. He ultimately does reconquer Jerusalem. Again, great statesmanship on his part, great generalship. Dude is probably one of the greatest, like, political figures of the age. The Third Crusade is raised to fight him. And this time, everyone actually joins up. Like, it's not this half-baked, group of, like, disreputable individuals. We get Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa showing up. We get, like, England's King Richard III, King Richard the Lionhearted. No, not King Richard III, good grief. King Richard the Lionhearted, like, he shows up and he wants to participate. So, like, we get actual armies led by actual kings on this one. But the whole thing falls apart pretty quickly. Like, Barbarossa immediately dies in a awkward bathing accident where he, like, forgot to take off his armor when he went bathing in the river and just drowns, like, immediately upon arriving in the Holy Land. Richard manages to, like, duke it out with Saladin for a while, but at the end of the day, he has to ultimately go back to England because things are getting chaotic there. If you know the story of Robin Hood, like, even the Disney version with Prince John, like, give it a moment, we'll talk about it. But yeah, like, while Richard was out of England, things got real weird up in England. The trouble is, like, on his way back, he actually gets captured by the French, who, remember, are not huge fans of the British, and they ransom their king back. Like, the whole thing is a giant mess. The Fourth Crusade is the real kicker, though. Again, as we talked about, this is the end of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, effectively. The Crusaders do in fact show up, but they are sidelined by the Venetians, who, like, basically contract them to do their dirty work and take over one of the local like, principalities that are frustrating their trading efforts. And then they finally show up in Constantinople, and the people in Constantinople are having their own succession crisis, and nobody pays them, so they basically just sack the city. And this guts the Byzantine Empire and sets them up for conquest by the Ottomans in a few hundred years. So, womp womp. There are, in fact, more crusades, but these are the four main ones that you should probably be aware of. At any rate, again, crusading becomes a lot less popular after the Third Crusade and gets to be more and more in the slapdash, ugly territory of popes trying to, like, wield their power and, just essentially engaging in, like, dick-waving with the Byzantines on the one hand and the secular power structures on the other. Now, during much of this, like especially between the First and Second Crusades, we have yet another crisis between the secular power structures in the Holy Roman Empire in particular, and the papacy on the other hand. Specifically, like this comes to such a head that the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, or Heinrich the Fourth, actually captures Gregory or Pope Gregory VII while he is performing Mass, which leads to this whole giant mess of cascading circumstances. Like, Gregory pronounces an interdict on Henry, like, the entire Holy Roman Emperor is, like, temporarily cast out of the Catholic Church. Like, this is one of the things that the popes can do after some of the synods, like, after the monastic reforms. And again, when you do this, this gets everybody ticked at you. So, like, as much as Henry does manage to conquer Rome, the subjects immediately revolt and are ticked. Henry V, likewise, he's like, okay, we're going to take the lands back from the church, back from the priests. And Paschal II, who is kind of like a really wimpy pope and who is very much capitulating to Henry's demands, do in fact accept this, but literally everyone gets upset about this. Like, Henry's subjects revolt. This sounds like an act of some kind of like sacrilege of some sort. The priests get ticked at Paschal for letting this happen. Ultimately, the whole thing comes down to this famous Concordat at Worms. And yeah, like, I know, why do they call it Worms? I don't know. It's what it is. It's medieval history. You just got to deal with the nomenclature. In 1122, we come to an agreement, and this agreement is all church and no state. So from now on, like, the church gets to give priests and bishops and cardinals their authority. They will not come from, like, secular leaders anymore. Like, forget the simoniacs and the sort of, like, buying out the papacy. Forget that. Like, we are not even going to let the Holy Roman Emperor, like, appoint a bishop or choose which priests get to be promoted. No, that is now under the exclusive authority of the church. Now, these leaders, these prelates, will receive their land from the emperor because, again, it's fair. You guys are the ones responsible for taking over territory, for maintaining the secular powers, including land ownership, money, etc., etc. So we let you give these people money. But that's it. So there is a strict division here. We understand that there is the ring and the crozier, i.e. the church, and there is the scepter, and that is the imperial power, and one like operates with one of these and the other operates with the other. So if you want to pay priests, that comes from secular powers. If you want to choose priests, that comes from religious authority. But as much as this sounds like a pretty even-handed deal, it does, at the end of the day, absolutely benefit the clergy and the papacy, because they get to choose their own people, and it's just up to, you know, the secular power structures to reward these people. And again, remember, like, all those peasants raised up against Henry V because he took their land back, not even because the Pope told them that they were under interdict or something. So within like 100 years or so, we get Pope Innocent III, arguably the most powerful pope in the history of popes. And I gotta stress, like, this includes that period before the Holy Roman Empire was even a thing. Like, Pope Innocent III is a tyrant among popes. He is in charge of the papacy for a good, like, 20 years, effectively, and he makes some very sweeping, single-handed reforms. He is not shy about pronouncing interdict or using his papal power to put secular powers in their place. And honestly, the best example of this is with King John and the whole Magna Carta business. Specifically, like, King John, again, having recently inherited the empire from Richard, after Richard did in fact come home, and, like, King John is now, like, the actual legitimate successor, although I should stress, everybody hates this guy. King John absolutely is having some trouble with some of his barons, and he reaches out to the Pope for help, and, like, the Pope won't help him, so King John is like, well, screw it, we're not going to pay attention to the Pope, and the Pope immediately pronounces him under interdict, which just gives those barons even more power, and the barons effectively force King John to sign this Magna Carta, this sort of unprecedented document in the medieval world, which drastically limits the power of the British king. Now, Nobody's happy about this, or at least nobody, of the original players. Like, as much as, Pope Innocent was originally intending to sort of like discipline King John and show him that he was subject to papal authority, like, he is absolutely an opponent of the Magna Carta. This defies God's will as far as Pope Innocent is concerned. You don't want to deal with barons. You want to deal with kings. You want to show that you have power over the one guy, not the whole bunches of guys. So this whole thing turns out to be a huge loss for both the British monarchy and to the papacy in some respect, but a huge win for the lords of the British world, which within 100 years, the king in England has determined that the best way to manage all of these lords, now that they have all of this power and authority over them, is to convene them on a regular basis in a parliament. Which, yeah, that's where the British Parliament comes from, and keep an eye on that, especially as you go into General Humanities II, because that's going to be a major foundational structure underlying basic political principles in the Enlightenment and beyond. Like, our government today is based on the British parliamentary structure. The Magna Carta is in many ways one of the first founding documents of democracy. It's a thing, folks, and it happens here because of an overreaching pope. Hooray! But meanwhile, Pope Innocent III is still busy changing the church as well. He's instituting new, rigorous doctrines like the doctrine of transubstantiation. He legitimizes and codifies all of the sacraments, insisting that there are 7 and that all 7 are going to be performed under the whole auspices of the church. He condemns the heresies that are running around at the time, specifically the Albigensians and the Waldensians, and even creates the monastic order of the Dominicans to sort of fight the Albigensians, but no more new monastic orders. Like, we've got enough of those because a bunch of mendicant orders have been cropping up, and we can't manage them all, and many of them are unruly to begin with. As much as this sounds tyrannical, I gotta stress, though, Guy has some decent things on the program as well, specifically all those cathedral schools. Like, now that we are starting to build cathedrals, now that we have these sort of centralized churches for major dioceses, now that we've got major centers of power for the bishops and archbishops in particular, these cathedrals have been training clerical figures, priests, and higher ranking clergymen for a while, but we are now opening up these schools to the public, which means we're going to see a spike in literacy, which is good news. Also, Jews and Muslims living in the Western European world apparently have to distinguish themselves by their clothing, so yeah, not great. Again, there's plenty of tyranny, there's plenty of fascism to go around here in the Middle Ages. Pope Innocent III is probably, or Pope Innocent III is probably one of the classic examples here. This is one of the most powerful figures in the age, absolutely wielding his power with an iron fist. Now, about those monks, though, because we do need to circle back around to that. The whole restriction on monastic orders is very much targeted against these new mendicant orders, i.e. monks that are wandering instead of monks that live in a monastery. This has always been a bit of a problem. Benedict himself largely came up with the rules because he hated wandering monks, mendicant orders, and wanted to very much codify them, and Charlemagne very much agreed, which is why he insists and enforces the rule of Benedict everywhere else. But here in the 11th and 12th century, we're seeing the rise of these new mendicant orders, these new wandering orders of monks that don't necessarily have a home, specifically the Franciscans, but the Dominicans as well. The Dominicans, I should stress, are very much a scholarly order. Yes, they are founded to combat the Albigensians, and they do a pretty dang good job of it, but nonetheless, they are deliberately impoverished. They eschew all the wealth and wealth accumulation that we see at some of the other monasteries. Again, so many of the monasteries become wealthy and powerful because of the services that they provide, because they own a whole bunch of land, and because that land becomes more and more valuable as time goes on. Instead, the Dominicans focus on scholarship. They are 100% dedicated to study, to writing, to philosophy, to religion, to theology, to preserving manuscripts and reproducing them. And they also very much are sort of integral to the foundation of the university system, which also sort of crops up here in the 12th and 12th century. 12th and 13th century, I should say. To this day, the Dominicans are sort of in charge of many of the most important Catholic universities in Europe, and they have quite a few over here in the States as well. The Franciscans, on the other hand, focus on poverty. Not so much scholars. They're founded by this guy, St. Francis of Assisi, who's this whole big deal. Like, he was this famous spiritual leader in the 13th century who, according to the saint tradition, like, he could talk to animals, and, he was very compassionate and loving, and he was always kind to people, which, is exemplary. He was a good dude. Hooray for that. But he very much insisted that the people in the order that he founded, his followers, his disciples, so to speak, absolutely were forbidden to have any wealth of any kind. That they would, in fact, depend on the charity of others, and in response, do whatever they could to help those others who were being charitable to them. So Francis is a heck of a guy. Like, if you are interested at all in Christian history, he is one of the most stand-up figures of the Christian Middle Ages. The Franciscan order, though, doesn't necessarily follow his strict poverty regulations. Eventually, the church, or the order, kind of divides between the rigorists and the moderates, where the rigorists are the ones who insist, nope, we're not going to have an abbey, nope, we're not going to have possessions, no, we're not going to have any wealth. Where the moderates are like, the church says we kind of have to, so we're going to go do that, and we're going to go found an abbey, and they tend to be the more successful ones because, again, they have money. So the Franciscans still have some holdouts, some rigorists who do insist on sort of like the wandering monk lifestyle, but most capitulate to the will of the church and do in fact found these Franciscan monasteries, which are less impressive and less wealthy than most of their Dominican or Benedictine counterparts, but still not quite what St. Francis had in mind, I suspect. So let's talk. It's the 14th century, and the world looks radically different than it did back during Charles's reign, but it is starting to look rather familiar to how it looks nowadays. France has become entrenched in its power and has become, like I said, sort of like the first nation to get its nationhood together. The Holy Roman Empire is still basically running a lot of Germany and is basically the power structure there, as well as northern Italy. Not a whole lot of change going on, but a lot of infighting along the way. England and Scotland have largely divided, but, England is now codified under its king's system, which is pretty entrenched at this point, not nearly all of the little infighting going on there. The world is starting to look a little bit more like the Europe of the Renaissance, the Europe of the future. Funny how that happens. But the one that we have sort of like not discussed all that much are the Italians. Because Italy has been either under the Holy Roman Empire, under the direct control of the popes, or being taken over, especially in southern Italy. Like, southern Italy has been taken over like a zillion times at this point, and it's kind of just a mess, has been for a while. But here in the 14th century, the Italian city-states start to get a little bit more powerful than you would expect. Now that the world is getting a little bit more stable, trade is becoming more and more possible, and especially all those Islamic traders that we talked about last time, they're all getting friendly with all of the Christian-adjacent traders, especially in the Italian city-states, because these are very accessible trade routes, seeing as they're right on the Mediterranean. Venice, in particular, becomes the trading hub of the 14th century world and becomes very rich and very powerful as a consequence. And as a consequence, many of these Italian city-states start to revolt against the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, start to achieve independence for themselves. Which is, I don't want to get too bogged down into this, but it does very much set up the Renaissance that's about to happen. So, you'll probably end up talking about that more in General Humanities II if you take it. For now, what I want to stress is that because of all of this unrest, the papacy becomes kind of a victim of all of this unsettlingness. And some of the popes ultimately wander over to France for protection while these papal states are, being threatened by these Italian city-states, and while the conflicts between the Italian city-states and the Holy Roman Empire are underway. This comes to a head at the beginning of the 14th century when a new pope is in fact selected, but the Cardinal Council is sort of like browbeaten by the French authorities into choosing a distinctly French pope. Like a French cardinal who is, possibly going to be selected for pope. Suddenly he is everybody's first choice because, again, there's a lot of external pressure going on. And when, in fact, Clement V becomes pope, he's like, no, I'm not going to Rome. It's too far away and it's too dangerous. I'm going to live here in Avignon instead. And this starts roughly 70 years of the Avignon papacy. And I gotta tell you, this, if like Pope Innocent III back in the 1210s was the most powerful pope, the Avignon papacy is the diametrical opposite here. These popes are absolutely under the thumb of the French king, and everybody knows it. And it very much sort of deteriorates the reputation of the papacy as being this, external mode of leadership, this religious power that is supposed to be above all of the secular powers. It very much starts becoming an arm of the French nation. And the British resent it, and the Holy Roman Emperor resents it, the Germans resent it, the new Spanish, they resent it. Like, everybody is ticked about this order. And again, these popes are starting to basically prefer and favor the French in all of their discussions. Now, Urban V is the last of these Avignon popes, and the next guy to take over, Urban VI, ultimately does decide to go back to Rome, very deliberately. Like in 1378, Urban VI is like, nope, we're done being under the thumb of French rulers, thank you very much. I know that Italy is a bit of a dangerous spot at the moment, but it has calmed down, most of the fighting is over, so I'm going to go back to Rome, thank you. And the French lose their shit over this, and they get really mad, and they're like, you know what, we're going to come up with our own pope, thank you very much. So they make a new pope for the Avignon papacy. Again, that same year, they convene a whole bunch of the cardinals, especially the French cardinals, get them to renounce their earlier decision of Urban VI and choose for Clement VII instead. So now we've got two popes. Now, this has happened before, like pope and anti-pope. It is a phenomenon, especially, in the, just after the Carolingian dynasty and just before. Occasionally there were disputes about who was supposed to be pope. Maybe the pope didn't leave clear instructions, or maybe a pretender to the throne rose up and no one knew which one was which, or whatever the case may be. This is the first time that we have this situation under the new cardinal structure, where the cardinals are supposed to elect the pope, because that's supposed to be a fail-safe against this stuff. Like, all the cardinals are responsible for choosing the pope, presumably they know who they chose. So the fact that so many of the cardinals are under the thumb of the French means that they can be basically browbeaten into choosing an anti-pope, or rather a new pope, depending on who you ask. Now, the whole thing is a giant mess. But a lot of the cardinals get together, largely in neutral territory, far away from France, agree that these French cardinals were out of line and try and get rid of them. And the solution that they come up with, largely under the auspices and guidance of the Holy Roman Empire, is that they're going to elect this new guy, Alexander V, and he is going to be the real pope because we, the cardinals, all agreed. In 1409, Council of Pisa, this guy is the pope now. Both of those other popes are not popes. Only nobody is willing to give up power. So Urban VI remains pope, or rather his successors remain pope. Clement VII and the Avignon papacy remains popes. And now we have three popes, all of which immediately excommunicate one another, immediately pronounce interdict on each other, and the whole thing is a giant mess. This is what is known as the Western Schism. It is this huge debacle in the history of the papacy. It is absolutely a giant mess. No one can agree who the spiritual leader is. Everyone's worried that they're all going to hell because there are no recognized authorities for the church. Eventually, at the Council of Constantine, the cardinals try this again. 1414, we're going to make yet another new pope, and this time people start to bow out. Alexander V immediately gives up power. Remember that he was the conciliar pope. He was supposed to, fix this in the first place, so he recognizes, yep, I did not succeed, so Martin instead is going to be the guy in charge. The Roman popes also decide, okay, cool, we're just going to let this guy be in charge. The pope in France, though, just succeeds to the next one, Benedict XIII, and doesn't give up power, but everyone's like, we don't care, and he just sort of, fades away, because nobody's recognizing him. So the schism is in fact resolved. It just takes 30 years, which means that papacy that everyone lost faith in back when the French were calling the shots is now even more eroded than ever. The papacy is probably at its weakest in history, which is important to remember because in 100 years there's going to be a giant Protestant Reformation. Again, take General Humanities II. During this process, though, between the 13th centuries and the 14th century and 15th century here, we see the monastic orders are starting to embrace a greater rigor in their practices. Again, now that we've sort of reached the Renaissance in the secular world, I want to cycle back to what's going on with the monks, with the clergy, etc., etc. And again, since the monks are sort of the central place where philosophy is happening, as these scholastics are having more and more rigorous discussions, there are more and more philosophical treatises being published throughout this period as well. So some of the greatest philosophers of the European world in the Middle Ages come from this sort of like high Middle Ages era as these writers are sort of debating with one another. So for example, we get Anselm of Canterbury, a monk from England who has like this fascinating doctrine of substitutionary atonement, and who also has like this absolutely famous proof of God's existence known as the ontological argument. Fascinating stuff. Not going to talk about it extensively here. But just after Anselm is writing, this is where Aristotle is starting to circulate among the monasteries. Remember, the Reconquista has like found all these Aristotelian texts in Arabic. They're getting translated into Latin. More and more monks are reading this stuff, are getting caught up with this stuff, and are doing what medievals do: square their perspectives with, or square the perspective of these writers with the perspective of the Bible. Again, like most of medieval philosophy and theology has been dedicated to, okay, what do we know about Plato? What do we know about Aristotle? How do we make the truth of the Bible correspond to this? How do we make this all fit together? The trouble is, now that Aristotle is the newest, hottest thing under the sun, everybody's writing about Aristotle, and now there's a bunch of pushback. So there's a whole bunch of conflict in the monastic tradition, as all these monks are writing back and forth saying, nope, you're doing too much Aristotle, or nope, you're not doing enough Aristotle. So we get St. Bonaventure, who is very anti-Aristotle. Like, he insists, no, we got to go back to Augustine. We got to, like, focus on Augustine predominantly and let Aristotle, just be this, thing that we study, not something we're trying to square with the church, because, again, he was a pagan. We can't trust him. By contrast, we've got this Siger of Brabant, who is hardcore, all in for Aristotle, and, he and Bonaventure go back and forth quite a bit. But the real sort of winner in this whole theological debate is our guy down here, Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican monk who writes this absolutely magisterial Summa Theologica, which becomes the default handbook, textbook, philosophical treatise of the Catholic Church for hundreds of years to come. Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian. He loves Aristotle, but he always separates Aristotle from church teaching and subordinates Aristotle to church teaching. So in his first famous section, where he always writes his book in questions, it's very typical of the medieval era. But in the first handful of questions, he very much explains that there are some things that only the Bible can teach us, that only revelation can present to us. And while rationality is important, and we should do it as much as possible, and therefore follow Aristotle as much as possible, we need to recognize that any time that there is a truth that cannot be received from rationality, like, for example, the resurrection of Christ, or the doctrine of the Trinity, again, fundamentally unprovable, fundamentally irrational, faith-based claims, we have to default to the church, which basically everybody is cool with. Even the extreme anti-Aristotelians are pretty chill with this particular interpretation of Aristotle. Aquinas also has a whole bunch of other really cool stuff going on. He explains the existence of free will by explaining that God, permits things with his will, much as Boetius had done before, but sort of elaborating on it and complicating and sort of filling in the details here. He very much leans on the authority of the senses in Aristotelian reasoning, but he also argues that when you apply these truths to God, they're not fundamentally untrue the way that Bonaventure might argue, or fundamentally true the way that Siger might argue, but instead are analogically true. He's awesome, absolutely the preeminent philosopher of the Middle Ages. I cannot recommend reading Aquinas enough. But alas, we do not have the time to go into any more detail than this. Instead, I do sort of want to talk about the art. But again, this is an area where I'm not nearly as expert. You want to talk literature, we can talk literature. And we will over the next couple of weeks. Again, we're going to be reading Sir Orfeo. We're going to read some parts from Dante's Inferno. But I do want to sort of look at the visual arts just enough to show how they're changing through this era. So we talked about the oratory at Germania des Prés in France in the 9th century, the sort of archetypal Carolingian work. We see early Romanesque architecture using a lot of the same traditions, a lot of the same sort of technique into the 11th century and beyond. Notice again the basic structure here, the cross-shaped structure of the church, which I'm pretty sure it wasn't intended as a church, but ended up being used as a church, is very obvious here. We see again like the nave is sort of lowered, and we get these round sort of like towers to the side. But notice that the arching is considerably higher. Like we are experimenting with newer techniques. No more of this flat roof stuff. Again, bad for snow. We still have like the central the central building, the central structure that reaches highest. We still have the sort of narrow windows, but notice that the windows are more ornate now. Like we actually are adopting some of the old Roman and Greek techniques with these kind of like inserted columns with their own sort of pediments and stuff. Something that is elaborated as we proceed further into the Romanesque movement, especially like the second Romanesque, such as the Speyer Cathedral in Germany. Again, notice more artifice, more use of decoration, more windows, more elaborate, larger windows. We still have the basic cross structure, but we're using multiple towers instead and a giant dome over here. We're still using the same materials, this kind of like composite stone that is being created, but at the same time it's more regular here. It's effectively more brick organized. This ultimately is sort of like the peak of the Romanesque movement in some respects. And notice we even got like a buttress down here. Sweet. But obviously, by the 12th and 13th centuries, again, with the efforts of the scholastics to adapt Aristotle to sort of renew their interest in math and science, with more and more people studying architecture and art, again, like so many of these movements are encouraging literacy, encouraging scholarship, we see more and more ambitious projects being undertaken. And this very much brings us to the Gothic era of architectural styles. Notre Dame de Paris, in particular, is a fascinating study architecturally. Like, I do not study architecture. Again, you'll probably figure that out from how roughly I speak of a lot of these buildings. But I do know Notre Dame de Paris, like, forward and backward. It was constructed over a long period of time, like, begun well into the Romanesque movement in 1163. But the facade and ultimately, like, the spire weren't completed until well afterwards, well into the 13th century and even beyond in the case of the spire. But Notre Dame very much was kind of a trial and error sort of construction, and as much as it is sort of this classic work of Gothic architecture, it is a classic of early Gothic architecture. It shows a lot of those Romanesque styles. Again, notice that we've got like the sort of columnar architecture over here at the nave. But notice that they are reinforced with these flying buttresses, of a like classic example of Gothic architecture. And notice that again, the transept in particular, these huge rose windows, again these columns that are made of this very delicate stone, like very small pillars and supports, allowing you to build these huge windows that let in all of this light. And of course the facade itself, which I don't have a picture of it here, but we'll see the facade of Amiens in a moment. Again, emphasizing all of this ornate sculpture, all of this ornate detail work, all of this verticality, again, all of these columns, all of these spires, all pointing up to God, up to heaven. This becomes sort of the hallmark of Gothic architecture. This sort of effort to make these places well lit, acoustically fascinating. Like, I've been in Notre Dame de Paris, and like one dude's voice way over here at the nave will carry the entire length of the church. Just fascinating stuff. But it's very much perfected in Amiens Cathedral. Like, this is widely considered sort of the hallmark of late Gothic architecture. And you can see that it has many of the same characteristics as we see on Notre Dame de Paris, but much more ornate, much more vertical. The stonework is much more delicate and much more detailed. The windows are considerably larger and, more ornate. The art style that is sort of like experimented with Notre Dame. Again, it takes like virtually 100 years to complete this building. In Amiens, they do it in 50, but they do it with intention. It all matches. It is all deliberately constructed as one whole thing. The flying buttresses are incorporated from the beginning of the work instead of the end of the work, and you can see that like they're incorporated into the structure more than they are here in Notre Dame de Paris. And honestly, like, as much as I was struggling to put this PowerPoint together, I think as I was sort of like trying to come up with examples of Gothic architecture and trying to show the rough progress from one to the next, that's really where this PowerPoint really started to click for me. This is what I want to show you about the Middle Ages. that as much as we usually refer to this as this, like, nothing period between the classical world and the Renaissance, it is capable of such incredible feats of art and architecture. But what is prioritized is the art, the craftsmanship, the amount of effort it takes. Like, again, these cathedrals take years, decades to build. And yet, with determination and ingenuity and devotion, it is passed from generation to generation. The task continues, and these great monuments of, in a certain respect, like collective human achievement, are created and perfected. Nothing else like this exists. Like, yeah, there's neo-Gothic architecture, and you can even see, like, examples of sort of these new Gothic-styled cathedrals, even in New York City, and something like St. Patrick's Cathedral. But the amount of effort on display here, the techniques as they're being pioneered here, truly reflect the medieval work ethic and the medieval devotion to God, to religion, to their craft. Likewise, look at the way that medieval illumination has changed, and for that matter, as it hasn't changed. On the one hand, the left side is a portrait of Ezra from the Codex Amatianus. Again, Amiatinus, the early Roman or the early Northumbrian Codex that is transported all the way to Italy. Like, again, that famous early, like, first full Vulgate text that exists on record. Like, this text, this is the illumination there. And notice that there is a great attention to detail, to color, to artifice. Notice that it follows a lot of those early Christian styles and priorities. You know, we're not interested in realism or naturalism. The idea that we're going to be portraying, like, 3 dimensions is not a priority here. Instead, it's all about communicating what is going on here symbolically. What is this person doing? What does their environment look like? And as is typical of these medieval illuminations, notice that it is very much like a peasant or person dressed in medieval dress, you know, accompanied by furnishings typical of the medieval world. But notice that space isn't a priority, like, all the angles are wrong. There's no effort to make this place look real, because that's not the priority of the artists here. We frequently judge these works on those grounds, say that they are, you know, primitive or rudimentary or reflect an artistic style that, you know, is in some way beneath the earlier classical styles or the later Renaissance styles. But that's not true. That's deliberate. Like, this is the priority of these artists at this time. Now, by contrast, this is the Parisian Book of Hours in the 15th century. And notice that all of the priorities have shifted. On the one hand, the color is still vibrant, but if anything, it's more vibrant, though that could just be a product of age, I suspect. But notice that, especially the art here, like, we are in a Gothic cathedral. We have clear, like, single-point linear perspective. There's an effort to make space, even if it isn't necessarily always consistent. Like, notice that this angle here and this angle here are totally wrong if you're in fact going for one-point linear perspective. Notice that the humans are presented more naturalistically. Their drapery is emphasized. Like, the clothes are meant to sort of fold over their bodies in deliberate and naturalistic ways. And notice how ornate the rest of the illustration has become. The framing is now every bit as important as the image itself. What I want to stress here, again, this would have taken weeks, if not months, just to do this page. And the medievals were tireless in their devotion to these works. We're absolutely concerned with the product that they produced, because God was watching. And all of these works of art, all of these manuscripts, all of these illuminations were intentionally a work of art for God. Were in fact an act of sacrifice, an act of devotion, an act of sacrament in some respects. This was sacred work, and they conducted it as though it was more important than they were. It was not just a job. Now, I also do want to point to the fact that the Middle Ages do take a lot of pages from the Islamic world as well. Like, I again emphasized earlier that I will die on the hill where I argue that, like, Ibn Hazm is the originator of the medieval romance. That is Ibn Hazm and the Muslim view of women and the Muslim view of love in particular were disseminated especially among the troubadours of the sort of like high Middle Ages, who then, you know, sort of like after singing these songs like orally, were adopted by the written tradition. Folks like Chrétien de Troyes, who would spin these stories into these elaborate romances, often taking place either in the era of King Arthur or during the Trojan War, as is the case with Troilus and Cressida, or even in our own age, in the case of, what's the guy's name? I always forget. But yes, there are plenty of contemporary medieval romances as well that I'm suddenly just blanking on. In all of these cases, this new view of love, this new view of relationships, this new priority on love, almost certainly originates in the Muslim world. Again, the Christian, like, Augustinian view really did not prioritize love in this particular way, saw love as being some sort of physical and therefore base attraction, and yet now we are sort of justifying this sexual liberality in one respect. And whether or not it's actually sexual, whether or not these courtly lovers actually ever consummate their relationships, is debatable. But at the end of the day, represents a clear influence of the Islamic world on the Christian medieval world. And also, this sort of combination produces some of the greatest works of literature of this era. Again, you know, Chrétien de Troyes and the Vulgate cycle that is produced afterwards, where you've got like Malory and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, like all of these works very much depend on this Muslim outlook, even if they do not recognize that sort of like heritage or lineage. But as much as it is in conflict with the older traditions, as much as we do have these increasing questions of how much we're going to trust the pagans and how much we're going to trust, you know, Christian teaching, you know, whether it's the conflicts about Aristotle or these efforts to create these, you know, beautiful monuments despite, you know, many years of sort of deprioritizing naturalism and these monumental edifices, in some sense, I think this all comes down to Dante. Dante is the first thing I teach in General Humanities II, and therefore it seems appropriate that it be the last thing I teach in General Humanities I. And I gotta stress, symbolically, Dante represents everything that is great about the medieval world. His work, The Divine Comedy, is itself a beautiful poem, an epic of the style that we've seen in something like the Song of Roland, or indeed like as far back as, you know, Virgil's Aeneid, and Dante drops a lot of hints to Virgil. We'll see that when we actually pick up the text. But it is also absolutely rooted in Christian thought, in numerology, in symmetry, in this sort of like aesthetic attention to detail that is absolutely parallel with the great Gothic cathedrals. You know, everything has to be ornate, everything has to be detailed. All of his chapters are numerically organized, so there's like 33 cantos in the Inferno, and 33 cantos in the Purgatorio, and 33 cantos in the Paradiso, and one canto to start them all off, making for a perfect 100 cantos, where all of the you know, organizations of all of the various places in the universe, heaven, hell, and purgatory, are all like divided into 9 circles, or 3 times 3, again 3 being the sacred number of the Trinity. And notice that there are 3 places, again heaven, hell, and purgatory. It's just this beautifully balanced work, but also very much rooted in the same medieval, you know, skullduggery that we keep seeing. Like, Dante is, like Boetius, exiled because of the conflicts going on in Italy. And he very much fills the hell that he creates with all of the simoniacs and all of the you know, corrupt lords and bishops that he was sort of like intentionally at war with. And he fills purgatory and paradise with his allies and with historical figures who, you know, he considers worthy of entrance into paradise. It is, at the end of the day, all of medievalism. The ugliness and the dirtiness and the corruptness and the tyranny and all of that is represented here, in some sense, truly faithfully. But it is also contextualized. Dante's story is, yes, about his voyages to heaven, hell, and purgatory. It is his opportunity to make political statements throughout, and this elaborate allegory for, you know, the voyage of the sinner as they're sort of like introduced to greater and greater glories. It has allegorical connections to the whole order of the cosmos, as well as political divisions and so on and so forth. And I don't want to downplay any of them. But at the end of the day, it is also a love story. It's about Dante and Beatrice. And Beatrice is this beautiful girl who Dante fell in love with, who has continued to love him throughout all time. And when Dante struggles with his era of, you know, lacking faith, when he is lost in the wilderness, it is Beatrice who comes to save him. As much as Dante's situation is mired in the political and internecine struggles of the medieval Italy, as much as it is a grotesque, like, worst of human behavior rooted in sinfulness and corruption sort of thing, like we see in Game of Thrones, or like we see in the violence of contemporary representations of the medieval world, Dante's solution is to make it make sense, to search for meaning, to characterize it as being just temporary, and to understand it in the greater context of his own salvation and God's great plan. He subordinates all of the like ridiculous awfulness of human beings to the glory of God in some respect. And at the end of the day, I tend to think that that's a much more mature way to handle the ugliness of the world than what we see from contemporary deconstructionist efforts to render the medieval world as gritty and horrible and realistic as possible. The medievals knew what evil was. The medievals knew what horror was. The medievals definitely knew what sin was. In many cases, they knew that personally. But they didn't get bogged down in it. They didn't let it dominate their perspective. They continued to seek something better. And I admire the heck out of them for that. And it's that I suspect enlivens this period of history for me. And it's what I hope that you take away from it. I hope that you recognize that as much as the medieval world is sort of covering up and glorifying and romanticizing a pretty dark age in European history, they're doing it intentionally. They understand what it is that they're doing and why it is that they're doing it. And as much as we in the 21st century are inclined to consider them backwards or primitive or superstitious, and as much as some of those appellations are true, it doesn't change the fact that in the end, much of the medieval world were optimists. And that's what helped them to get through the darkness that they lived in, to build a world that was better than the one that they lived in, to keep improving and keep worshiping and keeping their eyes forward. People did not prioritize themselves in the medieval world. One of the sort of thematic undercurrents of General Humanities II is that the Renaissance is the birth of the individual. But that suggests that here in the medieval world, the individual does not exist. There is only the collective. And there is something good about that, and there is something bad about that. The bad is that for many of these greatest accomplishments, the people who are responsible for them do not get proper credit. They are just servants to the greater purposes of the church, of God, of their country, of the world at large. And it's a shame that we don't know who was the original designer of Notre Dame de Paris, or who created the illustrations in Codex Amiatinus. But in another sense, it is noble. And I suspect that the writers and the authors and the architects and the artists would rather have it that way. We have lost sight of the collective in our fervent fascination with individualism. Here, at the end of the medieval world, we are seeing the world transforming. We are seeing the efforts of individuals overshadow the great movements of the collective, of religions and national identity and cultural prerogatives. And it's only going to continue into General Humanities II. What I would suggest is that as much as General Humanities II is a story of progress, in a sense, this is a high point in history. This is a moment where people put so much stock in their work and in their efforts that they are able to make these truly extraordinarily unprecedented, beautiful things. Things that are of absolutely wonderful import and significance because they care. Because it is more important to them that they create these great works than that they even survive. That's extraordinary. It's powerful. And it's what brings me back to this era in human history so frequently. What I find so profound and moving about it. What I find so aspirational about it. These are people who believe that God was watching everything that they did. And consequently, they were very careful about what they did. That, even if you don't necessarily believe in God, is a pretty noble thing to aspire to, I think. For next time, we're going to be looking at a couple of the medieval works of literature, specifically, again, following our theme, we're going to be looking at the medieval underworld. So next time we're going to talk about Sir Orfeo, which is a pretty short poem, but involves a very interesting retelling of the story of Orpheus. And after that, we will in fact be looking at some of the sections from Dante's Divine Comedy, and that's how we will close out the semester here. I look forward to talking about both of them with you very soon.